A peaceful Midwestern community is rocked by a tragic murder.
There was a gunshot wound to the head.
I just remember laying down and crying.
My heart had been ripped out. I couldn't believe that this was happening. Who would want to hurt it?
As authorities search for a suspect, the investigation descends into the dangers of online dating.
He said he was gonna go meet up with some guy on Grindr.
You don't know who you're meeting up with. It was a big fear.
Was this a date that went bad? Was this a set-up date as a robbery? Lots of questions.
The investigation will take a sharp turn as rumors of a toxic romance come into focus, leading to the discovery of a disturbing betrayal fueled by desperation.
They punished him to protect themselves.
They needed each other to survive.
I still cannot wrap my mind around how you can be so close to somebody and do something so horrific.
A quiet community south of Indianapolis, Morgan County, Indiana, may be best known for its family-friendly living.
Morgan County is a small rural area, about 30 minutes south of Indianapolis. It's a peaceful, quaint community with not a lot of crime.
But at 3 p.m. on September 13, 2019, a local resident calls 911 in a panic.
We've been smelling something for a couple of days here, and we just thought it was a dead animal, but there's a dead person laying up here in the ditch.
The caller reports the victim is lying along a fence adjoining her property.
And you're for sure that that person is deceased, right?
Oh yes, there was bugs crawling around him.
There's officers on the way. They're going to be there in just a few minutes, okay?
Investigators with the Morgan County Sheriff's Office are immediately dispatched to the scene.
I was on call, so I proceeded to the location. This particular area was isolated. It had one residence right off the road, and the area was shaded by trees and thick brush. The deceased person was in late stages of decomposition. When we looked at the body, it was difficult to even tell if it was male or female. There was a gunshot wound to the head. And I've noticed that the deceased's right pocket was pulled out. So that automatically had us leading to believe a possible robbery.
Most people carry cell phones. Most people have some kind of ID or credit card or money. So the fact that there was really nothing there led police to believe that maybe that was intended.
As we started looking at the scene, we found 7 9mm shell casings. We determined that it was an automatic handgun and possibly a Glock due to the indentions on the shell casings.
There was some blood found coming from the top of the fence to the bottom. There was some blood found on the rocks below the fence. It was the hypothesis or assumption at the time that the victim was going over the fence and then was shot.
When investigators speak with the 911 caller, she says she hadn't seen anything suspicious, but she had heard something 4 days earlier.
She had gone to sleep on September 9th at 4:30 and heard several gunshots. But it was a rural area, so there's a lot of target practicing and hunting, different people in that area shooting guns off, so it wasn't uncommon.
With no clear evidence pointing to who might be responsible, investigators focus on identifying their victim.
The body was transported to our Morgan County morgue, and then forensic pathologist did an autopsy on the deceased the next day. The forensic pathologist determined that it was a male, probably in their 20s, approximately 6'2", 6'3".
The pathologist confirms the victim died from a single gunshot wound to the head.
They couldn't say exactly when, but they just know the body had been out there for a few days. We also were able to get fingerprints from the deceased at the autopsy, and those were put into what's called APHIS. We got a hit on a fingerprint for a male out of Jacksonville, Illinois, named Alexander Jackson.
The Morgan County Sheriff's Office, they were asking themselves questions like, what was this guy doing out here? And why was he killed?
Born in Illinois in 1996, Alexander Jackson had always been bright and brainy.
Alex was born and raised in Jacksonville. He was a good kid, and he was really, really smart.
Alex was very outgoing, caring, bubbly. I mean, when you think of somebody that would literally give you the shirt off their back, I mean, that is him to a T.
He loved science. Everything with plants, trees. He would always hate seeing people cut trees down and everything. He always just wanted to do what he could to help the environment.
We called him Sid the science kid, because he would have all these, like, facts that no one, like, what? Why do you know that? You know?
When he graduated high school, he then decided to go to Western University in Illinois to study environmental science.
One day, his sophomore year of college, I guess there's a coming out day, he had posted this post. It said that I was gay.
He just really figured out who he wanted to be, what he wanted to do, and we were all just really proud of that.
After sophomore year, Alex decided to join his aunt in Indianapolis.
Alex moved in with me January of 2017. He wanted to come here to spread his wings. I was the person who kind of just introduced him to the scene, the gay scene, you know, on Mass Ave.
He did drag and things like that, and he was having a lot of fun with that.
In July 2017, he decided he wanted to get his own apartment. And I was kind of sad when he decided to leave because I really enjoyed having him around. But I was happy that he was finding his way in life.
But Alex's plans for the future would come to a tragic end on an isolated stretch of road nearly 20 miles from home in Indianapolis.
Once they got Alex identified, then the detective would reach out to the family.
I was able to get in contact with Alex's mother, Walona Jackson.
I remember them telling me that they had found him. That moment is kind of a blur. Because I was there by myself, I just remember laying down and crying.
I think I dropped to the floor. Felt like the part of my soul, my heart had been ripped out. I couldn't believe that this was happening. Who would want to hurt him?
I learned that Alex had moved to Indianapolis to live with his aunt, Heather. He was taking classes there and working a job and doing really good for the most part.
Alex's mother says her son's life had taken an unexpected turn after he moved out of his aunt's home in July of 2017.
He lived in an apartment complex, and something had happened above him, and so water had leaked into his apartment, and he ended up needing to leave.
Talking to Walona, he was actually staying with friends at different places and hotels, and I think that kind of got him in a situation where he was getting with the wrong people. He had quit his job and had quit school and had started to hang around some people that were partying a little too hard.
Alex called me and voiced some concern about the people that he had been hanging out with and that he had been doing things that maybe he shouldn't have been. He knew he needed to stop. It was quite a shock.
Coming up, a chilling discovery leads investigators to uncover a bitter conflict between friends.
He made a cryptic Facebook post in which he tagged Alex and said, "robbing the dead."
That post sounded very awful, especially the timing.
But a deeper look at Alex's dating life suggests a more sinister motive.
Anytime you're dealing with one of these dating apps, there's a concern that you don't know who you're dealing with. And unfortunately, there could be predators out there.
Investigators have identified 23-year-old Alex Jackson as the murder victim found off a rural road in Morgan County, Indiana. And law enforcement has learned that Alex's family had become concerned about him in recent months.
There was about a month or two there that I'm not sure exactly what happened, but things went downhill quickly. You know, the people he hung out with, I didn't know them. I knew his friends before, and all of a sudden, things changed.
These people, I had no clue who they were. No clue.
While Alex's family is unable to name any of Alex's new friends, they can offer investigators helpful insight.
Alex's car actually was in the shop, so he needed a rental car, and this family friend offered to get him a rental car for 4 days. And after that 4 days, they're like, well, why wasn't the rental car returned?
It was a short-term rental that would have been on September 6th. On the 10th, that rental car was not returned. They didn't know where the car was.
Investigators immediately begin the search for the vehicle, a 2018 Hyundai Elantra. They also issue a press release, hoping to identify Alex's new friends in the city.
It's important to know who was the last person to talk to him or had seen them. We were trying to locate names as far as who he hung out with and where he might have been. And with the press release, we had gotten a call from one of Alex's friends who gave us some information on who he had been hanging out with at the time.
One of the names mentioned was Chad.
According to the tipster, Chad had made an alarming post on social media on September 6th, 3 days before authorities believe Alex was killed.
On September 6th, Chad made a cryptic Facebook post in which he tagged Alex and said something to the effect of, "robbing the dead."
They were concerned about the post due to the fact that Alex was deceased.
That post sounded very awful, especially the timing.
So at that time, we locate Chad and we went and spoke with him.
When investigators confront Chad about the social media post, he alleges that Alex was the thief in question, not him.
Chad said that him and Alex were friends and that Alex had actually stayed with him for a while and that him and Alex had a falling out due to the fact that Alex might have taken some items from him.
Chad claims that the alleged theft occurred after the two friends partied together on September 6th.
Chad had bought some drugs and had used the drugs and had nearly overdosed. When he woke up, his money was gone and he blamed Alex for taking it. So he stated that he posted that due to the fact that he was robbing him while he was almost dying. So that was his explanation for the post.
The situation had bothered Chad, but he's emphatic that he didn't kill Alex.
We have a software that we use that actually can show which towers in an area that cell phones had sent data to. And when our evidence tech ran those numbers through, we found that Chad's number at the morning of the homicide was far away from the crime scene.
Cleared of any connection to Alex's death, Chad suggests they talk to Alex's closest friend in Indianapolis.
He advised that there was another person that Alex hung out with on a regular basis named Brittany Overton.
Alex really trusted Brittany and kind of looked at her as maybe a big sister. She was older and looked up to her for guidance, protection, stability. Brittany's name came up, and that eventually led the investigators to pay a visit on Brittany.
We proceeded to her grandmother's house and we talked to Brittany.
This is Mark Anderson with the Sheriff's Department.
Okay.
We are investigating Alex's death.
What happened to him?
He was shot and killed.
He was shot? I'm sorry. I can't.
She said she had been friends with Alex for a year or so, ran around with him on occasions and partied with him.
So had Alex ever lived with you or stayed with you, or have you ever lived with him?
He never lived with me. He was talking about getting an apartment together.
Okay.
According to Brittany, the last time she saw Alex was the evening of September 8th, 2019.
She said they were driving around in a blue rental car that Alex had. They had gone to a couple stores during the day, and at 11 o'clock that night, he had dropped her off at her house.
Brittany puts herself with Alex together at her house in the blue rental car. Alex leaves at 11 p.m., was supposed to come back. He never came back. So now we're getting a lot closer to what happened to Alex the morning of the night, when the neighbors heard gunshots at 4:30 a.m.
So we're not sure exactly who he was with or where he was at from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m.
He said he was going to go meet up with some guy on Grindr.
Grindr is an app where men can meet other men.
Did he say who that guy was?
No name. Like, okay, well, be careful, you know, come back if you want to, because he didn't have a place to stay at the point in time.
I was concerned maybe he met up with somebody on Grindr and that something had happened, and that we really wanted to find out who he met up with at that time.
Was this a date that went bad? Was this a set-up date as a robbery? Lots of questions.
One week after the body of Alex Jackson was discovered, his friend Brittany Overton has just told investigators that Alex planned to meet up with a Grindr date the night of September 8th, the last time anyone saw Alex alive.
Brittany said that he was meeting or talking to a male on a dating app. If it's true, Alex was with Brittany at 11 p.m. the night before he was killed, and he went on a Grindr date. How did this person come into play?
Anytime you're dealing with one of these dating apps, there's a concern that you don't know who you're dealing with. And unfortunately, there could be predators out there.
Detective Mark Anderson immediately obtains a search warrant for Alex's personal Grindr account.
When I got the information back from the dating app, it just gave me the username and when they would log in or log off. It didn't give me any names who they talked to. It didn't give me names that they hook up with or anything like that.
That reached a dead end. A lot of these dating sites are very discreet for the obvious reason.
But just as the investigation hits a roadblock, authorities receive crucial information that breathes new life into the case.
Alex's rental car was found by Indianapolis police, abandoned.
The rental car was found wrecked on a road in Indianapolis. The theory then is the people that killed Alex may have been the same people in the rental car when it was wrecked. So we did search warrants on the rental car.
When we got the vehicle back, we noticed that in the passenger seat, there was a set of keys. And we realized there was a car key to Buick.
The keys to the rental car were there, But this extra set of keys was significant to investigators because it led them to wonder, who did these belong to?
Also, interestingly about the rental car, the front plate of the radio was removed and the radio was actually pulled out. And we were able to recover some very good fingerprints of the right hand of an individual on top of the radio. Detectives, evidence technicians process for evidence, and of course it doesn't come back right away. So we're waiting on DNA, we're waiting on fingerprints.
While investigators wait on forensics, weeks pass without any new leads.
For the first several weeks, investigators didn't really have a lot to go on. They were reaching out to anyone who might have known Alex in the Indianapolis area. Unfortunately, they really weren't able to get any answers.
"5 weeks after Alex's death, investigators receive a promising tip from a concerned woman.
And we went and spoke with her. She stated that her grandson had told her that he had shot somebody named Alex. He then showed her on his phone an article from a local television station where Alex Jackson was identified as deceased in a homicide. She had asked him why, and he had made a comment that he thought that this person was going to try to hurt him. She gave me the name of Justin Blake. I had never heard that name in the investigation.
Justin's grandmother explains that 18-year-old Justin had had a tumultuous upbringing.
Justin grew up in Indianapolis, and at a very young age, his sister and him were taken from biological parents through Department of Child Services and spent some time in foster care, and he was adopted at one point in time. Justin had gotten into some trouble and had gotten incarcerated as a juvenile. It was too hard for them to take care of him, so they kind of washed their hands of him, and he went to the system.
Justin lived on and off on the streets. By the time he was 18, a fairly hardened individual, which is really sad.
Six months earlier, Justin had reconnected with his grandmother.
Grandma treated him with love, was concerned about his appearance, concerned about who he was hanging around with, but still, as a grandmother's love would be, what can I do for you? And Justin bared his soul and basically told Grandma that he'd killed somebody.
She was still in shock that he had said this to her, but she knew she was trying to do the right thing, so she gave that information.
Investigators know they need to speak with Justin immediately.
She told me he was at the Hendricks County Jail in October of 2019, that he had gotten arrested for having a stolen van and a stolen gun. And she was concerned that possibly that maybe that gun was involved in the case.
We had then a good belief that this person was a viable suspect in Alex's killing.
And that's when I went to the Hendricks County Jail and spoke to Justin. Justin, hey, good. I'm Mark Anderson with Overton County Sheriff's Department. This is Dean Minton. Okay. And first thing is, we're not here, you don't care what you were in here for. You absolutely don't care. Okay, we're here for something else. And you go back to your cell anytime. You don't have to talk to us. I advised him that I was here to speak to him about a homicide.
What a homicide is?
A man named Alex Jackson.
Alex Jackson.
And it wasn't until a short time later he stated, "Oh yeah, I know Alex."
But I have only met him 2 times.
Investigators inform Justin an anonymous tip has implicated the teen in Alex's murder.
So why would your name come up in this homicide?
I don't know, sir.
I mean, they specifically mentioned your name.
I mean, I have a bad reputation because I've been locked up.
Okay. You not shot anybody?
No, sir.
Okay. You didn't tell anybody you did?
No, sir.
He tried to explain that he only met Alex twice, and he tried to brush it off that he didn't really know him.
When asked how he met Alex, Justin tells investigators they were introduced through Justin's girlfriend.
What's the girl's name?
Brittany.
Brittany what?
Overton.
When I heard that, then it started clicking together that the two names were connected. Brittany and Justin.
Over a month after the shooting death of Alex Jackson, investigators in Morgan County, Indiana, have zeroed in on Justin Blake as the primary person of interest. When Justin reveals he was introduced to Alex by Alex's friend, Brittany Overton.
Investigators made the connection that Justin knew Brittany. In fact, the two had a relationship for some time. And add that to the fact that investigators were told by Justin's grandmother that Justin had confessed to killing Alex. These were strong pieces of evidence.
Justin was pretty much saying he's not involved. I don't know why you're here.
However, Justin does admit to being with Brittany and Alex on September 8th, the evening investigators believe Alex was killed.
Justin started to tell a story very similar to Brittany, that he saw Alex that night. Alex had a date on the dating app, and that Alex left in a blue rental car at 11 p.m. and never came back.
So you met Alex. He said that Alex dropped him off at the house. He never saw Alex after that. I just don't think you're giving me all the information.
I gave you all the information that I know.
We didn't talk to him much longer after that because we wanted to make sure we had another shot to talk to him.
While Justin is escorted back to his jail cell, investigators focus on the stolen weapon found in his possession during his recent arrest.
I then called the arresting officer in that case to confirm what kind of weapon that he was charged with. He had a revolver in his possession at the time, so it didn't match the shell casings that we found at the scene, due to the fact a revolver doesn't spin out shell casings.
They weren't able to find the murder weapon, so they strongly suspected that Justin had dumped the weapon shortly after the murder.
Still, investigators have no idea what motive Justin would have, or what role Brittany Overton might have played in the crime. Before circling back to Brittany, they focus their efforts on developing evidence against her.
So we did search warrants of social media, cell phone records, cell phone tower locations, anything that we could to either include or exclude someone as a suspect.
Brittany had clearly kept some interesting company.
There was some involvement in the drug community. Not terrible, but enough that she was on probation. We learned that Brittany met Justin Blake through a drug dealer. They had the same dealer.
Once I got the Facebook records for Brittany Overton, you can see that she's hanging with Justin a lot as a couple in pictures. Brittany and Justin did have a sexual relationship with each other. He had a bad guy persona about him already, and he was only 18 at the time.
I think in looking at some of the social media, she had a bad boy crush on him. There was some comment that all they've been through, they had a bond, like a band of brothers, thick as thieves type of bond.
When I'm going through her accounts, I'm finding conversations with her and other subjects in the criminal world Just days prior to the homicide, she's actually talking to people about wanting to get a gun.
Investigators are unable to determine if Brittany had acquired a gun. But as they continue analyzing her social media data and usage, they come to a startling realization.
Neighbors heard gunshots at around 4:30 a.m. on the morning of September 9th, which is believed to be the time that Alex was killed. And then at 4:45 a.m., Brittany logged onto her Facebook account and she unfriended Alex.
That stuck in our mind really hard. It was exactly 15 minutes after the homicide that she defriends Alex Jackson.
Once we had that foundation, then when those cell records came back, her cell phone put her in the area of North Man Road, very close to where Alex was killed at 4:31 a.m. on September 9th.
Investigators have the evidence they need to secure a warrant for Brittany's arrest. When they receive the forensic analysis on Alex's rental car, the case becomes more than circumstantial.
We sent a copy of Justin Blake's fingerprints to the state lab with the fingerprint that we found on the radio. They called back and confirmed it was a match to his fingerprints. So that places him in the vehicle. The DNA results on the keys, those DNA results came back to Brittany Overton.
The DNA, the phone records, all kind of put Justin there, Brittany there. There didn't seem to be any obvious motive, but it was time to roll up our sleeves, file the charges, and get arrest warrants for Justin Blake and Brittany Overton.
On October 3rd, 2020, more than a year after Alex Jackson's murder, police take Justin Blake and Brittany Overton into custody.
Justin had been in Hendricks County Jail for stealing a car and having a gun in his possession. But at that point, Justin had been released from jail.
Justin was in Indianapolis with a new girlfriend, and he was located at her residence. Brittany was found inside Indianapolis city limits.
All right, Justin, you remember me?
Investigators sit down with Justin first and confront him with the evidence stacked against him.
So why would I just kill somebody? That don't
Well, I don't know. Why would you? Was there something gone wrong? Do you have dope you wanted to buy?
Was it a fight?
Was there a fight?
No, sir.
He just denied it the whole time and said the same story he said before. He was given a voice stress test. He agreed to take one, and of course he failed it. After that, he pretty much said, "Oh, I want to talk to a lawyer."
Hey, Brittany.
Detectives next turn their attention to Brittany.
I think you want to get it off your chest of what happened and get justice for Alex.
I'm confused.
About?
So, you're saying that I'm associated with it because I witnessed it.
Did you witness it?
No, I'm saying, like, this is what he's saying.
Brittany, for 2 hours, played innocent.
We know you were there, 100%. When Alex died, you were there. There's no doubt in our mind.
And it wasn't until the detectives talked about that her phone records put her at the scene. There was no way she wasn't there.
These are all locations where your phone is pinging. That's the exact time Alex was killed. And you're all over here.
I think she finally realized, well, let's tell this story and see what happens. And then she gave a story of what happened that night.
All those pieces of the puzzle fell into place as we had planned.
Indiana authorities have arrested Brittany Overton and Justin Blake for the murder of Brittany's friend, Alex Jackson. While Justin continues to maintain his innocence, Brittany eventually cracks under the pressure.
Brittany told them that on the night of September 8th, Alex had picked her up in his rental car.
Brittany said Alex and her was running around, and at some point in time in the night, they picked Justin up.
They were driving around, partying a bit, and at a certain point, Justin suggested they go try to make some fast money.
They get Alex to contact a guy from Grindr, and they set up a date to meet him, and they were going to rob him.
According to Brittany, when the trio arrived at the apartment complex, Justin forced Alex to accompany him to the front door.
I sat in the car. They ended up going inside.
Brittany stated that when they met the guy, Justin started pistol whipping him. Brittany said that Alex didn't expect them to beat him up and be that violent.
So they went back in the room, and what they come out with, do you know?
I came out with some credit cards, an Xbox, I believe it was a PlayStation, it was one, and maybe a checkbook.
Brittany claims the trio partied for the next several hours, but Alex became increasingly upset about what had happened.
Alex has never seen this kind of stuff before. He's not a criminal. That must have been a shock.
He was kind of regretting doing the robberies and stuff and was talking about it.
There was a concern that Alex would snitch on them.
And they ended up on this road. And at that time, then Justin supposedly tells her to stop the car.
What do you mean, stop the car? He's like, stop the car. And he's got a gun, and it's held right here to my head. At that point in time, I was scared.
When she stopped the car, he then made the comment, "Alex, you know it's time." And at that time, she says, Alex looks over at her and said, "What's going on, Brittany?"
I'm freaking out. He said, "Brittany, what's going on?" I was like, "I don't know." And we're both pretty hysterical at that time. So Justin gets out of the car and pulls Alex out of the car.
Justin gets out with the gun in his hand, and she proceeds to look straight ahead and hears several gunshots.
Hear Alex screaming, anything like that?
Yeah, I did. It was just like a scared kind of scream and gunshots.
And then Justin gets in the front seat of the car. He had the gun in his hand and Alex's cell phone. And Justin drives her, drops her off, and says, "Don't say anything to anybody or you're gonna die." And then he drives off and leaves.
Investigators aren't buying Brittany's story. If Brittany was afraid of Justin, she certainly didn't seem to show it in the days after the murder.
Brittany admitted to police that they'd used the rental car for 2 days after the murder.
He had it hid for a couple days.
Okay, and then came back and got you?
Yeah.
She said that her and Justin were drinking and that he ran off the road and hit the tree.
So, you were in the car when the car was wrecked, right?
Yeah.
So I'm seeing now that she's more of a manipulative person, and you can see where she's doing anything she can to survive.
While Justin continues to deny any involvement, investigators have what they need to file charges.
We charged Justin Blake with murder and felony murder. Murder for shooting Alex, felony murder for stealing the car. We charged Brittany Overton only with, felony murder and robbery. We did not believe that she pulled the trigger.
I didn't know anything about Brittany, but I just needed whoever was responsible to pay for it. They took my baby. For no reason.
After the arrests were made, the family was happy, Milana was happy, my brother was happy, but now comes trial.
With Brittany's testimony and a mountain of physical and digital evidence in tow, prosecutors take Justin's case to a jury in February of 2022. While prosecutors don't need to prove motive as an element of their case, they believe they know why Alex was killed that night.
Alex fell in with the wrong crowd. He certainly wasn't hardened like Brittany and Justin. Ultimately, Alex was caught up in their crimes, and as soon as he showed a sign of weakness, they punished him for that, to protect themselves.
Obviously, they were intimate. They found some attraction to each other. I think it became a bond of what they did together that night, and then a bond of how they thought they could get away with it.
Despite Justin's defense team attempting to shift blame solely to Brittany, on February 24, 2022, the jury sides with the prosecution.
The jury convicted Justin of all counts: murder, felony murder, and robbery. We proceeded to sentencing, and the judge gave him 61 years.
In May 2022, Brittany Overton accepts a plea bargain.
The judge did credit her for testifying in Justin's trial. The judge ended up giving her 20 years with 17 and a half to do.
Brittany teared up a little bit, but I didn't think she was very remorseful.
I still cannot wrap my mind around how you could be so close to somebody like.
Before dawn on April 24th, SIL 2018, investigators in Sacramento were watching a house that had become the center of one of the longest and most haunting criminal investigations in American history. And inside that quiet suburban home lived a 72-year-old retired police officer named Joseph James D'Angelo, a man who appeared to have spent decades disappearing into ordinary life while investigators across California had spent decades searching for the predator known by names such as the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and eventually the Golden State Killer. For nearly half a century, the killer had existed in the public imagination as a shadow, a figure who seemed to have slipped beyond the reach of justice. But on that morning, the shadow was about to acquire a name, a face, an address, and a set of handcuffs. And the most astonishing part was that the breakthrough had not come from a confession, a surviving eyewitness suddenly remembering the killer, or a forgotten police report, but from a revolutionary use of DNA and genetic genealogy that allowed investigators to reach backward through 46 years of silence and identify a man who had lived for decades under the appearance of an ordinary life. The story began long before D'Angelo stood at the center of a police operation, long before investigators searched genealogy databases, and long before the phrase Golden State Killer became known around the world, because in 1976, in Sacramento County, a series of attacks began that would terrify communities, eventually span years, jurisdictions, and identities. The attacker was not immediately known, and at first there was no reason to believe the crimes would become part of one enormous investigation, because the first cases appeared as individual attacks, horrifying but seemingly isolated, committed against women in their homes, often at night, often after the attacker had carefully studied the environment around them. He was methodical. He watched. He learned routines. He exploited weaknesses. And once inside, he controlled the scene through fear. The terror was not limited to the physical violence. Victims described a man who appeared to understand how to manipulate fear, who could turn the safety of a private home into a place of unimaginable danger. In some cases, he entered through windows or doors after preparing himself for the attack. He used restraints, he issued threats, he created an atmosphere in which the victim could never know whether resistance would make the situation worse. The attacks became a nightmare that spread through neighborhoods because the killer seemed able to appear almost anywhere. In the Sacramento area, investigators began connecting cases and recognized that they were dealing with a serial offender. The East Area Rapist became the name associated with the crimes, and the investigation expanded. Detectives studied crime scenes. They interviewed victims. They collected physical evidence. They developed descriptions. They tried to understand how the offender selected homes and why particular victims were targeted. Yet the killer seemed to stay ahead of them. Every new attack created another wave of fear and another challenge for police. Residents changed locks. People became cautious about leaving windows open. Darkness became associated with danger. Ordinary nighttime sounds became suspicious. The killer's greatest weapon was not simply violence. It was uncertainty. No one knew where he would strike next. And then the geography widened. The crimes moved beyond the Sacramento region. The same offender was eventually connected to attacks in other parts of California, including communities in Contra Costa County, Stockton, and Southern California. The name changed as the crimes changed. In Southern California, investigators began calling him the original Night Stalker. The different names reflected the fragmented nature of the investigation. Police agencies were dealing with crimes across different jurisdictions, and for years, the full scope of the offender's activity was not completely understood. What would later become known as the Golden State Killer case was therefore not originally one case at all. It was a collection of crimes, investigations, jurisdictions, victims, and evidence that gradually began forming a single terrifying picture. The offender's pattern was devastating. He raped women. He attacked couples. He murdered victims. He entered homes where people believed they were safe. In some cases, he appeared to take extraordinary precautions to avoid detection. He watched neighborhoods. He learned habits. He sometimes prowled around homes before entering. He understood that darkness, isolation, and surprise could give him control. And the psychological impact was enormous. Victims were not simply assaulted. Their sense of safety was shattered. The place where people slept, where families lived, where children grew up, became a potential crime scene. For investigators, the challenge was equally enormous because every attack generated evidence, but not necessarily an identity. They had fingerprints in some cases. They had physical description. They had DNA from sexual assaults. They had witness accounts. They had photographs and sketches. They had patterns. But they did not have the one thing they needed most: a name. Years passed. The East Area Rapist investigation became one of the largest serial crime investigations in California. Detectives worked through enormous amounts of information. Tips arrived. Suspects were examined. Leads were pursued and eliminated. A composite image of the attacker circulated widely. Authorities offered reward. The public was repeatedly reminded to remain vigilant. Yet the man himself seemed to vanish. Then came the murders that transformed the investigation again. In 1978, Brian and Katie Maggiore were killed in Rancho Cordova. Their deaths would later be associated with the East Area Rapist investigation. Although the exact connection was not understood immediately, the killer continued. By the time the series of crimes eventually ended, he had committed a horrifying pattern of violence that would later be attributed to him. At least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries, according to the FBI. The numbers alone are staggering, but statistics cannot fully communicate what those crimes meant to the people who experienced them. Each number represented a person. Each attack left a family changed. Each murder created another permanent absence. And each unsolved crime strengthened the belief that the offender might never be caught. Then, after years of attacks, the crime stopped. The silence was almost as disturbing as the violence. There was no public explanation, no arrest, no confession, no body of evidence leading investigators to a courtroom. The killer simply disappeared from the known crime pattern. For investigators, that did not mean the case was over. It meant the case had become cold. The files remained. The evidence remained. The unanswered questions remained. But the world moved on. Decades passed. California changed. Technology transformed. The detectives who had worked the original cases retired or died. Victims aged. Children became grandparents. The killer, whoever he was, grew old. Somewhere, perhaps, he lived an ordinary life. He paid bills. He drove cars. He spoke to neighbors. He watched television. He stood in grocery stores. He existed among people who had no idea that the man beside them might be connected to one of the most notorious unsolved crime series in American history. Meanwhile, the biological evidence collected from victims remained critically important. In the late 20th century, DNA profiling revolutionized criminal investigation. Evidence that had once been useful only in limited ways could now be transformed into a genetic profile. In the Golden State Killer investigation, DNA became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence because investigators could establish that biological material from different crime scenes came from the same unknown offender. The profile did not initially tell them who the person was, but it told them something equally important. The same man had committed multiple crimes. It could exclude suspects. It could connect cases. It could preserve a genetic fingerprint of a murderer who had successfully avoided identification for decades. The problem was that the DNA profile did not automatically produce a name. Investigators could search law enforcement databases for a matching offender, but the killer did not appear to have a profile that solved the case. The genetic evidence could say, "This is the same man." It could not yet say, "This is Joseph James D'Angelo." That distinction would define the investigation for decades. The case became a battle between the permanence of DNA and the limitations of identification. The biological evidence could survive. The killer could grow old. But without a match, the investigation remained suspended. Then the world entered a new era. Genetic genealogy began changing what investigators could do with unidentified DNA. Commercial genealogy databases had been created for people searching for biological relatives, ancestry, and family connections. Millions of individuals voluntarily uploaded genetic information for those purposes, but investigators began recognizing that the same networks could potentially help identify unknown people from crime scene DNA. Instead of searching only for an exact match to the suspect, investigators could look for relatives who shared portions of the unknown genetic profile. From those relatives, genealogists could build family trees. From family trees, they could identify possible branches. From those branches, investigators could narrow the field. It was a fundamentally different approach. The killer did not have to appear in the database himself. A relative might be enough. That was the breakthrough the Golden State Killer investigation had been waiting for. In 2017, investigators began working with forensic genetic genealogy to examine the killer's DNA profile. The work was painstaking. It required comparing genetic relationships, researching family histories, building enormous genealogical trees, and eliminating people who did not fit the available evidence. The process was not magic. It was investigative work performed at the intersection of genetics, genealogy, and traditional police methods. The unknown DNA became the starting point. Family connections became the map. And slowly, investigators began moving toward a specific identity. The case that had been dormant for decades suddenly had momentum, but there was one extraordinary problem. The person they were searching for was not a young fugitive hiding in another country. He was potentially an older man living an ordinary life somewhere in California. The investigation therefore required patience and secrecy. If investigators moved too quickly, they could alert the suspect. If they made an error, the entire case could collapse. The stakes were enormous because the world was watching. The Golden State Killer had become a symbol of an unsolved American nightmare. Generations had grown up knowing his name without knowing his identity. Victims had lived with memories that could not be erased. Families had waited for answers. Investigators had refused to let the evidence disappear. And now, after more than 4 decades, the investigation was approaching a man whose identity would shock the public precisely because he appeared so ordinary. Joseph James D'Angelo was born in 1945. He had served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam era and later became a police officer. He had worked for law enforcement in California. He had married. He had children. He had lived in the Sacramento area. Two people around him, he could appear to be an ordinary retired man, yet investigators were beginning to believe that this quiet, elderly resident was connected to the crimes that had terrified California decades earlier. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. The killer had spent years studying police behavior, avoiding detection, and exploiting the limitations of forensic science. Now science was reversing the advantage. The very technology that had not existed when the crimes began was being used to reconstruct his family tree. The past was closing in, and the investigation was about to enter its most dangerous stage because identifying a possible suspect through genealogy was only the beginning. Investigators needed confirmation. They needed DNA directly connecting the man they were watching to the genetic evidence preserved from the crimes. They needed proof that could survive in court. So as April 2018 approached, detectives watched, waited, and prepared. The man they suspected had spent approximately 40 years avoiding arrest. He had survived the disappearance of the original investigator. He had survived the evolution of technology. He had survived decades of public attention. He had survived the creation of DNA databases and the rise of modern forensic science. But he had not survived the one thing he could never control: the passage of science into the future. Somewhere inside the genetic data of distant relatives, investigators had found a path toward him. Somewhere inside the old evidence, the killer had left a biological signature. And somewhere inside a quiet Sacramento neighborhood, a 72-year-old retired police officer was about to discover that the case had never really forgotten him. 46 years after the first known attacks, the longest silence was finally beginning to break. The Golden State Killer had spent decades becoming a ghost, but ghosts leave traces, and in this case, the most important trace was microscopic, invisible to the human eye, preserved inside evidence collected from victims who had survived attacks and from crime scenes where lives had been permanently shattered. Because long before investigators knew the name Joseph James D'Angelo, they had something far more valuable than a name. They had the killer's DNA, and that biological signature would eventually become the thread that connected crimes separated by hundreds of miles and many years, turning what had once looked like a collection of terrifying but fragmented cases into the work of one offender. In the late 1970s, however, none of that was clear. Investigators were still dealing with a predator who seemed to understand how to exploit every weakness in the communities he entered. He did not simply attack randomly. His crimes showed preparation. He watched neighborhoods. He learned patterns. He appeared to understand how victims lived and when they were most vulnerable. The East Area Rapist became a name that carried fear across Sacramento County because residents knew the attacks were not confined to one isolated location. The offender could move. He could observe. He could wait. Then he could strike. The victims often experienced the same terrifying realization. The person who had entered their home had come prepared. He sometimes used restraints. He sometimes disabled telephone. He sometimes appeared to know how to move through a house without drawing attention. His behavior suggested someone who had studied his surroundings carefully before committing the attack. For detectives, that meant the offender might be learning from every investigation. Each police response potentially taught him what authorities knew and what they did not know. Every newspaper report could reveal how much evidence had been discovered. Every public warning could tell him what investigators were looking for. The case became an enormous contest between an offender who adapted and a police system struggling to predict his next move. At the beginning, the crimes were concentrated around Sacramento and nearby communities. Investigators began linking reports and recognizing similarities. Victims described an attacker who wore disguises and concealed his identity. He was described as a white male, often wearing a mask or other covering, and his behavior was controlled and deliberate. The police developed composite sketches based on surviving victims and witnesses. Those sketches became familiar to the public, but familiarity did not produce identification. Thousands of men could resemble a composite drawing. The killer had no known name, no confirmed address, no known vehicle that could be tied conclusively to every attack, and no DNA database matched that could put him behind bars. The investigation continued through the late 1970s, and the offender eventually expanded beyond Sacramento. In 1979, attacks in Contra Costa County demonstrated that the threat had moved beyond the original area. In 1980, the crimes reached Southern California, where the offender became known as the original Night Stalker. At first, investigators in different regions did not necessarily understand that they were looking at the same person. The geography itself created confusion. Different agencies had different files, different victims, different investigative teams, different terminology. What would eventually become a single case had to be assembled from separate pieces. That process took years. In Orange County and elsewhere in Southern California, investigators confronted murders that appeared connected to sexual assaults. The offender was becoming more dangerous. He had moved from a pattern dominated by sexual violence and burglary into lethal attacks. Couples were targeted. Victims were killed. The fear surrounding the crimes deepened because the offender seemed capable of escalating. The case was no longer only about an unknown rapist. It was about a serial predator whose crimes included murder. The later understanding of the Golden State Killeress known crimes would become staggering. 13 murders, 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries were attributed to him. Yet during the years when the crimes were happening, investigators did not possess that complete picture. They were trying to understand an offender while he was still active. The evidence was scattered across jurisdictions and time. The terminology changed, the investigative priorities changed, but the offender continued to leave behind something that would eventually become decisive: biological evidence. At the time, investigators could not exploit that evidence the way modern forensic laboratories could. DNA profiling had not yet become the revolutionary investigative tool it would later become. That meant evidence could be collected and preserved without immediately producing an identity. A sample could establish that a biological trace belonged to the offender, but it could not automatically tell investigators who that offender was. As forensic science advanced, however, the old evidence gained new power. DNA profiling could generate a genetic profile from biological material recovered from crime scenes. Suddenly, investigators could compare samples across cases. If the same genetic profile appeared in multiple investigations, the connection was strong. The crimes were no longer merely similar, they could be scientifically linked to the same individual. This was crucial in the Golden State Killer investigation because the offender had committed crimes across different parts of California and across several years. DNA helped establish that the East Area rapist and original Night Stalker were not simply similar offenders. They were the same person, but knowing that the crimes belonged to one man was only half the problem. Investigators still needed to discover who that man was. The DNA profile could exclude suspects. It could tell police that a person was not the killer, but unless the killeress DNA was already stored in a law enforcement database, the profile could remain anonymous. The technology could identify biological relationships, but there was no automatic button that translated a genetic sequence into a human name. The killer remained unidentified. That was the cruel irony. Investigators knew more about the offender than ever before. They knew the same person had committed numerous crimes. They had DNA, they had descriptions, they had behavioral patterns, they had photographs, sketches, and decades of investigative work. But all of those pieces still failed to produce a name. The case became one of California's most notorious unsolved investigations. The reward increased, public interest returned periodically, detectives continued reviewing leads, but the killer remained outside the reach of conventional investigative methods. Then time began doing something unusual. It started working against the killer instead of for him. The original detectives aged and retired. New generations of investigators entered law enforcement. DNA technology became more sophisticated. Computer databases became larger. Genealogy became increasingly popular. Millions of people voluntarily submitted genetic information to commercial services in order to discover relatives or learn more about their ancestry. Those databases were not created to solve murder, but investigators began to recognize a possibility that had previously been almost unimaginable. If the killer himself had never submitted DNA, perhaps one of his relatives had. And if a relative could be found, investigators might be able to work backward through a family tree until they reached the unknown offender. The method became known as investigative genetic genealogy. It was different from traditional DNA matching. Traditional forensic identification often depends on finding the suspect's own profile in a law enforcement database. Genetic genealogy could work indirectly. Investigators could upload an unidentified crime scene profile to a database that allowed such searches, identify genetic relatives, and then use genealogical research to construct family relationships. The unknown killer became a branch hidden somewhere inside a much larger tree. The investigator's job was to find the branch. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most important early examples of this approach. In 2017, investigators began exploring genetic genealogy as a possible way to identify the offender. The DNA evidence had existed for years. What changed was the investigative question. Instead of asking, "Does this DNA match a known suspect?" investigators could ask, "Whose relatives share enough DNA with this unknown offender to help us identify his family?" That was a radically different strategy. It turned ancestry information into an investigative map, but it also required extraordinary care. A genetic relative could be distant. Family trees could contain errors. Records could be incomplete. Names could change. People could move. Investigators had to distinguish between genuine genetic connections and coincidental relationships. They also had to ensure that the person they eventually identified actually fit the physical, geographical, and historical facts of the crime. Genealogy could point investigators towards a suspect, but it could not, by itself, prove that person was the killer. That distinction would become critical. The investigators needed to build a bridge from the database to the courtroom. The process involved genealogical research and traditional police work working together. Investigators identified relatives connected to the unknown DNA profile. They constructed family trees. They examined generations of relationships. They narrowed the possibility. They considered age, location, family history, and other known facts about the offender. Slowly, the enormous universe of possible people became smaller. The investigation moved toward a specific family line. Eventually, attention focused on a man named Joseph James D'Angelo. Born in 1945, D'Angelo had lived much of his life in California. He had served in the Navy and had worked as a police officer. He had a wife and children. He had lived in communities that placed him within the geographical framework investigators were examining. The possibility was extraordinary. The Golden State Killer had spent decades appearing to be an unknown predator. Now investigators believed they had identified him as a retired law enforcement officer. The irony was almost unbearable. The man who had terrorized communities and evaded investigators for decades had apparently spent part of his life inside that very system designed to catch people like him. But investigators did not immediately announce his name. They needed proof. Genetic genealogy had generated a lead. The next step was confirmation. Detectives began surveillance. They watched D'Angelo. They studied his movements. They needed a biological sample that could be compared directly with the crime scene DNA. The operation had to remain secret. A premature confrontation could jeopardize the investigation. A mistaken identification could destroy years of work. Every move mattered. The suspect was now an elderly man, but investigators were not looking at age. They were looking at evidence. If the DNA matched, the decades of uncertainty would finally end. If it did not, the investigation would have to return to the family tree. In April 2018, detectives were ready to move. They had spent months examining the genealogical evidence and conducting surveillance. The man they believed was the Golden State Killer was living in Sacramento. On April 24th, investigators approached his home. The scene was remarkably ordinary. There was no abandoned hideout, no secret bunker, no dramatic escape attempt. There was a suburban residence and an elderly man who had lived there for years. The suspect who had once terrorized California was now 72 years old. Detectives took him into custody. The arrest stunned the public because it revealed something almost impossible to imagine. The Golden State Killer had not been hiding in another country or living under a false identity. He had apparently been living in plain sight. The man at the center of the case had spent decades aging like everyone else while the investigation remained frozen in time. But the arrest was only the visible end of the operation. Behind it were 46 years of evidence, victims, detectives, DNA testing, genealogical research, surveillance, and persistence. The public saw handcuffs. Investigators saw a chain of evidence stretching back to the 1970s, and the most important link still had to be confirmed. Police had to establish that the DNA of Joseph James D'Angelo matched the genetic material preserved from the crime. The old evidence had already survived one generation of technology. Now it was about to deliver its final answer. The case that had begun with frightened residents, midnight attacks, and desperate detectives was entering its last investigative stage. The unknown offender finally had a name, but before that name could become a conviction, investigators needed the science to speak one more time. For 46 years, the Golden State Killer had seemed to have escaped into history. Now, history was standing at his front door. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo on April 24th, SIL 2018, was the moment the Golden State Killer case exploded back into the national spotlight. But for investigators, the handcuffs were not the end of the operation. They were the beginning of the final proof, because after decades of unanswered questions, investigators had finally narrowed the investigation to one man, and now they needed to demonstrate through independent DNA evidence that the man living quietly in a Sacramento neighborhood was the same offender whose biological profile had been preserved from crimes committed more than 40 years earlier. The scene outside D'Angelo's home was almost painfully ordinary. There was no dramatic chase, no gun battle, no fugitive barricaded inside a fortified hideout. The suspect was an elderly retired police officer, 72 years old, living a life that appeared far removed from the terror associated with the Golden State Killer. But investigators knew that appearances meant nothing. The case had taught them that repeatedly. For decades, the offender had concealed his identity, adapted his behavior, and disappeared into the background. Now detectives had to make certain that the breakthrough created by genetic genealogy was not merely compelling, but correct. That distinction mattered because the history of the investigation was filled with false leads, mistaken theories, and suspects who had once appeared promising before being eliminated. The Golden State Killer had evaded identification for so long precisely because investigators had never been able to connect the unknown DNA profile to a living person. Genetic genealogy had changed that, but genealogy was an investigative tool, not a substitute for forensic confirmation. The DNA had pointed toward D'Angelo. Traditional forensic science would have to establish the match. That final comparison was what would transform a genealogical lead into evidence. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from D'Angelo after his arrest. The sample was compared against the biological evidence preserved from the crimes. The result was decisive. The DNA associated with D'Angelo matched the forensic profile investigators had attributed to the Golden State Killer, the man who had existed for decades as a sketch, a description, a collection of behavioral patterns, and an anonymous genetic profile finally had an identity. Joseph James D'Angelo was the man investigators had been searching for. The confirmation was extraordinary not simply because of the identity itself, but because of the distance between the crime and the arrest. The first known attacks had begun in 1976. D'Angelo was arrested in 2018. 46 years had passed. Entire generations had grown up while the investigation remained unresolved. Victims had aged. Families had changed. Detectives had retired. Technology had transformed. Yet the DNA collected from the original crimes had survived long enough to connect the past with the present. The arrest, therefore, represented more than the capture of a serial offender. It represented a collision between two eras of forensic investigation. In the first era, detectives relied on interviews, physical evidence, sketches, surveillance, intuition, and conventional databases. In the second, investigators could use genetic information to construct family relationships and search for a suspect indirectly. The breakthrough came because those two eras were finally combined. The original evidence provided the DNA, modern genealogy provided the path. Traditional police work confirmed the identity. The result was a case that had seemed impossible for decades suddenly moving at extraordinary speed, but the public still had to confront the question that made the arrest so shocking. Who was Joseph James D'Angelo? Born in 1945, D'Angelo had served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam era. He later became a police officer in California. He worked in law enforcement in Exeter and Auburn before his career ended after he was dismissed from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. He later lived in the Sacramento area. He married and raised a family. To the outside world, he could appear to be an ordinary man who had reached retirement age. That contrast made the revelation difficult for many people to process. The Golden State Killer had been imagined for decades as a mysterious predator who had somehow vanished. Now the alleged offender was no longer a shadow. He was a specific man with a documented life. The discovery also forced investigators to revisit the entire history of the case. Could the crimes now be understood through the lens of D'Angelo's life? Did his employment in law enforcement help him understand police procedure? Had his movements over the decades placed him within the geographical patterns investigators had previously mapped? How had he managed to remain unidentified for so long? These questions were not merely public curiosity. They were part of the process of understanding the investigation and preparing the prosecution. But perhaps the most powerful evidence remained the DNA itself. DNA did not care about age. It did not care about retirement. It did not care about the suspect's reputation. It simply compared biological marker. The genetic profile recovered from the crimes matched the man investigators had identified through genealogy. The science had done what generations of detectives had been unable to do. It had turned an unknown offender into a named defendant. The arrest also brought renewed attention to the victim. For decades, the public had known the killer through his crimes and aliases, but the people he attacked had often been reduced to statistics. Now their stories could be told again with a different ending. The attacks had begun in Sacramento County in 1976. The offender entered homes at night and terrorized women. He later attacked couples and committed murder. The crime spread through California, and the offender became known by different names in different regions. Eventually, investigators connected the East Area rapist crimes to the original Night Stalker murders. The combined series became the Golden State Killer case. Officially, authorities eventually attributed 13 murders, 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries to D'Angelo. Those numbers represented decades of fear. Each crime had its own victim. Each victim had a family. Each crime scene had its own investigators, yet the same DNA profile tied the offender together. The biological evidence created a continuity that the fragmented police investigations could not initially provide. That continuity was one of the most important reasons the case could finally be understood as a single criminal career. For decades, the killer had benefited from jurisdictional boundaries and changing investigative terminology. Now DNA erased those boundaries. The same genetic profile could be compared regardless of which police agency had originally investigated the crime. A murder in Southern California and a sexual assault in Northern California could be connected by biology. The geography no longer mattered as much as the genetic evidence, but the prosecution would still have to establish individual crimes, individual victims, and individual acts. The DNA match did not automatically prove every allegation investigators associated with D'Angelo. It provided a powerful identification. Prosecutors then had to build a case capable of holding together in court. As investigators reviewed the evidence, another disturbing element emerged. D'Angelo had apparently spent years attempting to avoid detection. During some attacks, he threatened victims and warned them not to cooperate with police. In some cases, he appeared to take steps designed to minimize evidence or prevent victims from identifying him. His behavior suggested a person who understood the mechanics of investigation and the psychology of fear. The fact that he had once worked as a police officer added another layer to the public shock. Yet investigators had to remain focused on evidence rather than speculation. The question was not whether D'Angelo seemed capable of the crime. The question was whether the evidence could establish his responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The answer would eventually come through a combination of DNA, investigative records, physical evidence, and the detailed reconstruction of decades of crime. The arrest also demonstrated how dramatically investigative genetic genealogy had changed the possibilities of cold case work. Before genealogy, investigators could have the killer's DNA and still have no idea who he was. After genealogy, relatives could become the starting point for identification. That did not mean every case could be solved. It did not mean every database contained the necessary information. It did not eliminate the need for traditional investigation. But it created a new pathway when conventional methods had reached a dead end. The Golden State Killer case became a landmark because it demonstrated that an unknown offender could potentially be identified through relatives who had never met him and had never been involved in the crimes. The implications were enormous. Investigators around the country began considering whether the same strategy could be applied to other cold cases. Victims whose killers had remained unidentified for decades suddenly had a new possibility. Old DNA evidence might not be useless. It might be waiting for a genealogical connection, but the technique also generated serious questions about privacy. People who submitted DNA to genealogy services generally did so to learn about ancestry or relatives, not to become part of a criminal investigation. The use of such databases raised questions about consent, law enforcement access, and the boundaries of genetic privacy. The Golden State Killer investigation, therefore, became both a law enforcement breakthrough and a landmark in an emerging ethical debate. The case demonstrated what investigators could accomplish with genetic genealogy, but it also forced society to confront how powerful genetic information had become. A person could submit DNA to learn about family history and unintentionally help investigators identify a distant relative accused of a serious crime. That possibility would become one of the defining questions of the new era of forensic genealogy. But for the victims and families connected to the Golden State Killer, the immediate concern was simpler. The man they had feared for decades had finally been identified. The arrest produced a flood of memory. Victims who had spent years trying to rebuild their lives now had a name for the person who had attacked them. Families of murder victims finally knew that the investigation had reached a suspect. Communities that had once lived under the shadow of an unknown predator could finally understand that the shadow had a human face. The emotional impact was immense. Some survivors had spent decades wondering whether the attacker might still be watching them. Others had moved forward with their lives but never completely escaped the memories. Now the person responsible was no longer an abstract figure. He was in custody. Yet even after the DNA confirmation, the legal case remained ahead. Prosecutors had to decide how to proceed against a 72-year-old defendant accused of crimes spanning decades. There were multiple jurisdictions and numerous victims. The scale of the alleged criminal conduct was extraordinary. Prosecutors eventually chose a strategy designed to bring the case to resolution while ensuring that the victims and their families received a formal acknowledgement of what had happened. The process would ultimately lead to a plea agreement years later, but in 2018, the immediate reality was that one of America's most notorious serial offenders had finally been arrested. The moment was almost impossible to reconcile with the decades that preceded it. For 46 years, investigators had chased a man who seemed to have vanished. Now they knew where he lived. They knew his name. They knew his DNA, and they had him in custody. The Golden State Killer had spent decades relying on the limitations of his era. He had operated before DNA profiling became widespread. He had disappeared before genetic genealogy existed. He had survived the retirement of detectives and the closing of old files, but he could not survive the arrival of technology that turned distant family relationships into investigative evidence. The killer who once seemed invisible had left behind a genetic fingerprint. That fingerprint had been waiting in the evidence. Then, slowly, the world learned how to read it. And once investigators learned how to read it, the 46-year silence ended almost overnight. The arrest was the headline. The DNA match was the proof. But behind both was a much longer story, one involving victims who refused to be forgotten, investigators who kept old evidence alive, scientists who transformed biological traces into genetic profiles, genealogists who built family trees, and detectives who followed those trees until they reached a retired police officer living quietly in Sacramento. The most astonishing part was that D'Angelo had not been found because he suddenly made a mistake in 2018. He had been found because investigators finally gained access to a kind of information that had not existed when he began his crime. Time had changed the rules of the investigation. The same evidence that once seemed insufficient had become decisive. The same unknown DNA that had once represented a dead end had become a map. And the man who had once been known only by frightening aliases now had nowhere left to disappear. The moment Joseph James D'Angelo was identified, the Golden State Killer case entered a new and even more difficult phase because identifying the man was only the beginning. Investigators now had to prove what he had done, how many crimes could legally be attributed to him, and whether the evidence collected across for decades could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. And behind every charge stood a victim whose life had been permanently altered. A family that had waited years for answers, and a crime scene that had once seemed destined to remain frozen in history. For the public, the arrest in April 2018 was the stunning moment for prosecutors. It was the starting gun. D'Angelo was 72 years old. The crimes attributed to him had begun in 1976 and stretched across more than a decade. The investigation involved multiple California jurisdictions and different eras of police work. The offender had been known by different names depending on where he operated: the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, eventually the Golden State Killer. Each name represented a different chapter of the same terrifying history, but bringing those chapters together in a courtroom required extraordinary coordination. The case could not simply rely on the dramatic revelation that investigators had discovered D'Angelo's identity through genetic genealogy. Prosecutors had to connect him to specific crimes. They had to establish evidence that would survive legal challenges. They had to account for victims, witnesses, physical evidence, DNA, and the passage of decades. And they had to do it while the world was watching. The arrest immediately attracted national attention because the identity of the Golden State Killer had been one of the great unanswered questions in American criminal history. For years, investigators had released composite sketches and asked the public for information. Rewards had been offered. Victims and their families had waited. Detectives had retired without seeing the case solved. Now a retired police officer had been arrested and identified as the man behind the crimes. The irony was impossible to ignore. D'Angelo had worked in law enforcement during part of his adult life. He had knowledge of police procedures. He understood how investigators operated, and yet the investigation that eventually caught him relied on a scientific technique that had not existed when his crimes began. The old evidence had outlived his ability to hide. The prosecution soon revealed the extraordinary scope of the allegations. D'Angelo was charged in multiple counties with crimes including murder and sexual assault. Authorities had already connected him through DNA to a series of attacks, but the legal process needed to separate what could be proven from what could merely be suspected. That distinction is essential in any criminal prosecution, and it was particularly important here because the Golden State Killer investigation involved dozens of victims and crimes committed over many years. The public knew the broad outline. Prosecutors had to establish the individual fact. The biological evidence became one of the most important foundations. Investigators had preserved DNA from sexual assault cases dating back decades. Those samples had allowed police to develop a genetic profile of the unknown offender. When D'Angelo's DNA was obtained after his arrest, it matched the profile. The genetic evidence was powerful because it did not depend on a witness remembering the face of a masked attacker decades later. It did not depend on a suspect admitting what he had done. It came from biological material preserved from the original investigations. The science connected the past to the present, but prosecutors still had to explain the evidence in a way that a jury could understand. DNA can be extraordinarily persuasive, but its significance depends on proper collection, testing, interpretation, and presentation. Investigators had to establish the chain of custody and demonstrate that the biological material had been handled appropriately. Experts had to explain the genetic comparisons. Defense attorneys would have the opportunity to challenge the conclusions. Every detail mattered because the prosecution was dealing with evidence that had survived for decades. Meanwhile, investigators were reopening files that had been dormant for generations. They examined reports from the 1970s and 1980s. They reviewed statements from victims and witnesses. They revisited crime scenes. They compared old descriptions with the known history of D'Angelo. The sheer volume of material was enormous. A crime that occurred more than 40 years earlier does not come with a clean, modern digital file. It comes with paper reports, handwritten notes, photographs, laboratory records, physical evidence, retired databases, and memories that have faded with time. The investigators had to reconstruct the past while working in the present. Every document had to be understood in context. Every piece of evidence had to be evaluated according to what was known when it was collected and what modern science could reveal now. The victims were at the center of this reconstruction. For decades, many had carried the burden of what happened without knowing the identity of their attacker. Some had been teenagers or young adults when the crimes occurred. By 2018, they were older. Some had children and grandchildren. Some had spent decades trying to move forward. The arrest reopened memories that many had worked hard to contain. The man they had feared was suddenly a real person with a name and a photograph. For some survivors, the news produced relief. For others, it brought anger, disbelief, or a painful return to memories they had tried to leave behind. There was no single emotional response. Trauma does not follow a single pattern, and neither does the passage of time. But one thing had changed for everyone. The question mark was gone. The person accused of the attacks was in custody. The investigation was no longer chasing a ghost. It was building a case against a defendant. The murders added another dimension. The Golden State Killer was not merely accused of sexual assaults and burglaries. He was also connected through investigative work and evidence to multiple killings. The deaths of victims such as Katie and Brian Maggiore, Lyman and Charlene Smith, Keith and Patrice Harrington, Manuela Withen, and Janelle Cruz formed part of the larger history eventually attributed to D'Angelo. Each murder had its own family and its own investigation. Some victims were attacked inside their homes. Some were coupled. The offenderess violence had escalated over time, and the murders had left communities with questions that remained unanswered for decades. Now prosecutors were attempting to establish the full scope of that violence. The passage of time created practical difficulties. Some witnesses had died. Some evidence had been lost or degraded. Memories were no longer fresh. But the investigation also possessed something that earlier detectives did not: decades of accumulated knowledge and modern technology. Old evidence could be retested. Old case files could be compared electronically. DNA could connect cases that investigators had once considered separate. Genetic genealogy could provide investigative direction. The same passage of time that had complicated the prosecution had also given science opportunities that did not exist in the 1970s. The case therefore became a strange collision between decay and preservation. Human memory deteriorated. Biological evidence remained. Investigators changed. DNA did not. The killer aged. The genetic profile did not. The world around the case transformed, but the evidence retained its ability to connect one moment to another. As prosecutors prepared their case, the public learned more about how the genetic genealogy breakthrough had occurred. Investigators had taken the unidentified DNA profile from the crimes and used it to search a genealogy database that permitted such investigative comparisons. The results revealed genetic relatives of the unknown offender. Genealogists then constructed family trees and narrowed the possibilities. The process was meticulous. It required identifying family connections, researching records, and determining which branches could logically lead to the unknown offender. Eventually, D'Angelo emerged as a viable candidate. But investigators did not simply arrest him because his name appeared on a family tree. They used genealogy to generate the LED and then obtained his DNA to confirm it. That distinction became a defining feature of the case and an important point in the broader discussion about investigative genetic genealogy. Genealogy provided the map. Traditional forensic testing provided the confirmation. Police work connected the science to the person. The method was powerful precisely because the technologies reinforced one another. The arrest also transformed the public understanding of what a cold case could become. For decades, the Golden State Killer had seemed like a case that might never be solved. There had been too much time, too many victims, too many jurisdictions, too little identifying information. Then the rules changed. The case demonstrated that cold did not necessarily mean dead. Evidence could wait for technology. A DNA profile could remain useful for decades. A genealogy database could create a new investigative pathway. A retired detective could revisit a file with tools that had not existed when the crime occurred. A case could move again, but the breakthrough created a new question. Why had D'Angelo remained free for so long? Investigators knew that the offender had been careful. He had concealed his face. He had changed location. He had apparently monitored police activity. He had used fear to discourage victims from resisting or reporting details that might identify him. He had taken advantage of the limitations of forensic science. But the answer was not simply that he was extraordinarily clever. The historical circumstances mattered. When the crimes began, DNA profiling was not available. There were no massive genetic genealogy databases. Computerized criminal databases were far less sophisticated. Communication between agencies was slower. Records were often physical. The offender operated during a period when a person could leave biological evidence without understanding that decades later it might become an identification tool. In other words, the killer had benefited from the technology of his time. He was ultimately defeated by the technology of another time. That transformation was perhaps the most remarkable element of the case. The Golden State Killer had spent years trying to control what investigators could know about him. He concealed his identity. He exploited darkness. He used disguises. He avoided leaving obvious identifying information. But DNA had created a permanent record he could not erase. Even if investigators did not know his name, they knew the biological signature of the man responsible. That signature became the case's silent witness. It waited through the 1980s. It waited through the 1990s. It waited through the 2000s. It survived the retirement of detectives and the aging of victims. Then, when genetic genealogy became available, it became the starting point for an entirely new investigation. By the spring of 2018, the mystery had changed completely. The question was no longer who is the Golden State Killer. It was how do we prove that Joseph James D'Angelo committed these crimes? The answer would involve evidence gathered across decades and a legal strategy designed to bring an enormous collection of crimes into one coherent prosecution. Investigators had already accomplished the hardest part in some ways. They had found the man, but now the case had to survive court. D'Angelo faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Prosecutors faced the responsibility of representing victims whose cases had remained unresolved for generations. Families faced the prospect of hearing details of long-buried crimes repeated in public, and survivors faced the unsettling reality that the man they had spent decades trying not to think about was now at the center of national attention. The arrest had broken the silence, but the courtroom would have to give that silence meaning. The case had begun with fear. It had survived through evidence. It had been reopened by science. Now it was moving toward accountability. Yet one enormous question remained hanging over the prosecution. After 46 years, could the legal system finally tell the full story of what Joseph James D'Angelo had done, not as a legend, not as a collection of aliases, and not as an unsolved mystery, but as a documented series of crimes with victims whose names had waited far too long to be spoken alongside the truth? By the time Joseph James D'Angelo stood before the court, the Golden State Killer was no longer a faceless figure hiding behind a mask, and the prosecution no longer had to ask the public to imagine what had happened in California during the 1970s and 1980s, because the evidence had survived long enough to tell the story itself. But turning 46 years of terror into a courtroom case was going to require something more difficult than identifying the offender. It required giving the victims a voice without forcing them to relive every moment, connecting separate crimes into a coherent pattern and confronting a defendant who had remained silent for decades. D'Angelo was arraigned in Sacramento County after his arrest, and the charges against him represented only a portion of the enormous criminal history investigators believed they could attribute to him. The allegations included murders and sexual assaults committed across several California counties. The scale was staggering, but the prosecution could not simply place every unsolved crime in front of a jury and ask them to assume the same man was responsible. Each charge required evidence, each victim mattered. Each crime had to be treated as its own event, even while investigators demonstrated the larger connection through DNA and other evidence. That distinction became increasingly important as prosecutors examined the case files that had accumulated since the 1970s. For decades, the offender had been known through different identities. In Sacramento, he had been called the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, he became known as the original Night Stalker. Only later did the combined series become widely recognized as the Golden State Killer case. The names themselves reflected how fragmented the investigation had been. Different agencies had been confronted with different crimes. The connections were not immediately obvious. Investigators had been working without the benefit of modern DNA databases, and there was no genetic genealogy system capable of linking the unknown offender to distant relatives. Now those historical barriers were being dismantled one by one. DNA had already linked the crimes to a common offender. Genetic genealogy had helped identify D'Angelo. Traditional investigative work had confirmed his identity. The remaining challenge was to establish responsibility for the individual crimes that formed the prosecution. As prosecutors prepared, the stories of the survivors became central. For many of them, the announcement of D'Angelo's arrest was not simply a news event. It was a message from a past they had spent decades trying to escape. Some victims had built entire lives after the attacks. They had married. They had raised children. They had moved to different communities. They had careers, grandchildren, friendships, and ordinary routines. But the memories remained. The offender had taken something that could never be completely restored, the assumption that home was safe. Many of the attacks had occurred inside residences, places where people normally lowered their guard. The Golden State Killer had turned ordinary houses into scenes of terror. He had entered while people slept. He had threatened victims. He had controlled them he had sometimes attacked couples, binding them and using one victim's terror to control the other. The psychological damage extended far beyond the hours of the attack. Victims had to continue living in the same world after the offender disappeared. They had to sleep again. They had to enter dark rooms again. They had to hear noises outside their homes again. And for decades, they did not know whether the man who had attacked them had been caught, had died, had moved away, or was still somewhere nearby. The arrest changed that uncertainty. The unknown man finally had a name. The defendant finally had a face. And the investigation could finally answer questions that had haunted survivors for generations. But the legal process moved carefully. The prosecution could not simply rely on the emotional power of the case. It had to meet the standards of criminal law. DNA evidence would be crucial, but prosecutors also had to establish that the samples were authentic, properly preserved, and scientifically reliable. Experts could explain how DNA profiling had connected the crime scene evidence to D'Angelo. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence and its interpretation. This was not merely a historical investigation anymore. It was a criminal prosecution in which every scientific conclusion could be tested. The remarkable age of the evidence made that process even more significant. Biological material from crimes committed more than 4 decades earlier had survived. In a modern laboratory, that evidence could provide information that investigators in the 1970s could never have imagined. The forensic profile became a kind of time capsule. It preserved the biological identity of the offender while the rest of the world changed around it. The killer grew older. The victims grew older. The detectives changed. The technology changed. But the DNA remained capable of answering the same question. Was this the same man? The answer was, the genetic genealogy breakthrough had already suggested the identity, and the direct DNA comparison after D'Angelo's arrest confirmed it. That scientific confirmation was one of the strongest elements of the prosecution's case, yet the murders themselves required another level of proof. Several homicide investigations had originally been conducted without knowing who the killer was. Detectives had collected evidence, interviewed neighbors, examined physical surroundings, and documented injuries. Some cases had generated witnesses or forensic evidence. Others had remained mysterious for decades. Now investigators were reopening those files with the knowledge that the same offender had been identified. The new perspective allowed them to examine old evidence differently. Connections that once seemed speculative could be evaluated in light of the DNA evidence and the known history of the offender. The case of Katie and Brian Maggiore, for example, had long been surrounded by questions about whether their deaths were connected to the East Area rapist. Their 1978 killings had occurred during the period when the offender was active in the Sacramento area. The possibility that they were victims of the same man had remained part of the broader investigation for years. Other murders in Southern California were more directly connected through the investigation into the original Night Stalker. Lyman and Charlene Smith were killed in Ventura County in 1980. Keith and Patrice Harrington were murdered in 1980. Manuela Withen was killed in 1981. Janelle Cruz was murdered in 1986. These names were not merely entries in a serial killer timeline. They were people whose deaths had left families with questions that remained unanswered for decades. The families had experienced the strange cruelty of a case that never seemed to end. A murder normally produces an immediate search for the person responsible. Detectives pursue leads. Suspects are questioned. Prosecutors may eventually bring charges. Families wait for a trial. But in a cold case, the waiting can become indefinite. There is no courtroom, no verdict, no sentence, no definitive answer. The family is left with the possibility that the truth may never be known. For the families connected to the Golden State Killer, that possibility lasted for decades. Then, in 2018, everything changed. The arrest meant the families could finally confront a legal process rather than an empty investigation. But it also meant painful memories would return. Court proceedings would expose details of crimes that some victims had spent years trying to put behind them. The prosecution had to balance the need to prove the case with respect for those who had survived it. The defendant's age also became part of the story. D'Angelo was not the young man investigators had imagined when the crimes occurred. He was 72 when arrested. His appearance was dramatically different from the composite images released decades earlier. Time had transformed his face. His hair had changed. His body had aged. The image of the elderly suspect standing before cameras seemed almost incompatible with the photographs and sketches that had circulated during the height of the attack. Yet DNA erased the problem of appearances. The science did not care that 46 years had passed. It did not care that the suspect had aged. The genetic markers remained. The evidence connected the elderly defendant to the younger man whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scenes. That was one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The killer had aged, but the evidence had not forgotten him. As the prosecution moved forward, the public began learning more about the man behind the crime. D'Angelo had lived for years in Citrus Heights and later in other Sacramento area communities. He had daughters. He had grandchildren. He had worked as a police officer. People who knew him were forced to reconsider what they thought they knew. The revelation produced a profound psychological shock because the Golden State Killer had long been imagined as a monster hiding somewhere beyond normal society. Instead, investigators said the offender had lived within it. The case became a reminder that outward appearances provide little protection against hidden behavior, yet the courtroom could not be built around shock alone. The prosecution had to remain anchored to evidence. DNA records, witness testimony, investigative findings, physical evidence. The passage of time created weaknesses, but the surviving evidence provided strength. And as the legal strategy developed, another possibility emerged. Rather than forcing every victim and family through a lengthy trial involving dozens of individual crimes, prosecutors and defense attorneys could negotiate a resolution that would establish D'Angelo's responsibility for a large number of crimes while avoiding the uncertainty and emotional burden of multiple trials. That possibility would become especially important because of the sheer number of allegations. The prosecution eventually announced a plea agreement in which D'Angelo would admit responsibility for 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges tied to the sexual assault. The agreement also addressed dozens of uncharged sexual assaults that were beyond the statute of limitations or otherwise could not be prosecuted separately. But that moment was still ahead. In 2018, the investigation was still fresh from the arrest, and the public was still absorbing the realization that the Golden State Killer had finally been found for victims. The arrest could bring relief and fear at the same time. Relief because the man was in custody. Fear because the past was suddenly present again. The legal process forced old memories into the open, yet there was also something powerful about finally hearing the name Joseph James D'Angelo spoken in connection with crimes that had once been attributed only to an unknown predator. The mystery was no longer anonymous. The investigation had crossed a line from uncertainty into accountability. 46 years earlier, police had stood at crime scenes trying to understand how a masked attacker could repeatedly enter homes and disappear. They had searched neighborhoods, interviewed witnesses, circulated sketches, and pursued leads. They had preserved evidence even though they could not yet fully exploit it. Decades later, that evidence had returned to the center of the investigation. The DNA profile had survived. The genealogy search had provided the family connection. The surveillance operation had located the suspect. The direct DNA test had confirmed the identity. Now the courts would determine what happened next. And beneath the legal language, beneath the forensic terminology, beneath the headlines announcing the arrest, remained the same human reality that had existed since the first attack. People had been hurt. Families had been destroyed, and lives had been permanently changed by a man who believed he could disappear into the passage of time. He had counted on the limitations of the era in which he committed his crimes. He had counted on victims being afraid. He had counted on police not having enough information. He had counted on distance and time, but he had not counted on the evidence surviving long enough for science to catch up with him. The Golden State Killer case had become a race between memory and biology. Memory faded. DNA remained. Witnesses aged. Evidence waited. Investigators retired. Databases expanded, and eventually, a family tree led detectives to a front door in Sacramento. The man who answered that door could no longer hide behind an alias. He was Joseph James D'Angelo. The next question was no longer whether the Golden State Killer existed. It was how much of the terrible history could finally be placed on the record, and whether the victims who had waited 46 years would finally have the opportunity to tell the court, in their own voices, what the killer had taken from them. By the time the prosecution began preparing for trial, the Golden State Killer case had become far more than the story of a mysterious predator finally identified by DNA. It had become a confrontation between a defendant who had remained silent for decades and survivors who had carried the consequences of his crimes for most of their lives. And every courtroom decision now carried the weight of a history stretching back to 1976, when the first known attacks began. Joseph James D'Angelo had been arrested. His DNA had been confirmed against evidence from the crimes, and investigators had connected him to an extraordinary series of attacks across California. But the legal system still had to determine how the case would move forward because there were dozens of victims, multiple murders, and crimes scattered across several counties, each with its own history and its own surviving evidence. The prosecution faced a choice that would shape the final chapter. They could pursue an enormous trial involving many individual crimes, requiring victims and witnesses to revisit events that had happened decades earlier, or they could negotiate a resolution that would establish responsibility through a comprehensive plan. The second path eventually became the one chosen, but before that agreement was reached, prosecutors spent months building the strongest possible case. The DNA evidence was central. The genetic profile developed from biological evidence collected during the original investigations had already linked the crimes to a single offender. After D'Angelo's arrest, investigators obtained his DNA and confirmed the match. The science had transformed the case, but prosecutors knew that the courtroom would still demand precision. They had to show how the original biological evidence had been collected, preserved, analyzed, and compared. They had to establish that the evidence had remained intact despite the passage of decades. They had to demonstrate that the DNA profile was reliable, and they had to be prepared for defense arguments concerning the interpretation and admissibility of the evidence. The age of the case made those questions especially important. A murder committed in 1978 did not come with digital photographs or electronic laboratory files. The evidence belonged to another era, yet investigators had preserved it, and advances in forensic science had allowed it to be examined in ways the original detectives could not have imagined. That preservation became one of the quiet heroes of the investigation. Without it, the genetic genealogy breakthrough would have been impossible. The genealogists could only work because there was a usable DNA profile. The profile existed because evidence had survived. And the evidence survived because investigators had treated biological material as something worth preserving, even when it could not immediately solve the case. The Golden State Killer investigation therefore demonstrated something crucial about cold cases. Sometimes, the most important investigative decision is simply not to throw the evidence away. A sample that seems limited today may become decisive tomorrow. A photograph that seems ordinary may become significant when combined with new information. A handwritten report may reveal a connection after another case is solved. Time can destroy evidence, but it can also increase the value of evidence that survived. While prosecutors worked on the legal case, survivors and families were preparing for an emotional confrontation with the past. The arrest had already triggered memory. Now the prospect of court proceedings created another wave. For some victims, the defendant S. age was particularly striking. The man accused of attacking them was no longer the figure they remembered. Decades had transformed him. The young or middle-aged predator they had encountered had become an elderly defendant, yet the memories remained fixed in time. Trauma does not age in the same way a face does. A survivor might look at a 72-year-old man and still remember the person who stood in the darkness decades earlier. The difference between those two images could be almost impossible to reconcile. The prosecution also faced a practical problem. Many victims had been reluctant to speak publicly for decades, and some had never expected that they would ever be asked to participate in a prosecution. The cold case nature of the investigation meant that the original reports and interviews were often the most reliable sources of information. Witnesses had aged, some had died, memories had changed, but the investigative files contained the details recorded when events were still fresh. Those records became crucial in reconstructing the history of the attack. The Golden State Killer's crimes were not isolated incidents. Investigators had identified a recognizable pattern. He often entered homes at night. He frequently targeted women alone, but he also attacked couples. He used restraints and threats to control victims. He sometimes engaged in bizarre and calculated behavior designed to maximize. He appeared to understand the vulnerabilities of the homes he entered. The attacks were intimate and invasive, which made the psychological impact especially severe. The victims had been attacked in spaces where they expected protection. Bedrooms, living rooms, houses in ordinary neighborhoods, places associated with family and safety. The killer transformed those spaces into scenes of terror. His ability to enter private homes undetected became one of the defining features of the case. Communities responded by changing behavior. People installed locks. They watched their windows. They listened for unusual noises. Neighbors warned one another. Children grew up hearing about the predator. The fear became part of local culture. And when the attacks eventually stopped, the absence of new crimes did not immediately create relief. It created uncertainty. Was the killer dead? Had he moved away? Was he imprisoned for another crime? Had he simply stopped? No one knew. The mystery remained alive. That uncertainty was one reason the 2018 arrest was so powerful. It did not merely identify a suspect. It answered a question that had existed for more than 4 decades. The killer had not disappeared into another country. He had not died anonymously. He had not been permanently lost to history. He had been living in California. He had grown old. He had a family. He had a house. And he had apparently believed that the passage of time had made him safe. The arrest proved otherwise. As the prosecution developed, investigators continued reviewing the full scope of the case. Authorities ultimately attributed 13 murders, 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries to D'Angelo. The number of crimes was enormous, but the prosecution did not attempt to prosecute every allegation individually. Some offenses were too old to prosecute because statutes of limitation apply. Others could be acknowledged as part of the larger history without being separate charges. The legal case would therefore focus on crimes that could be prosecuted and proven. This distinction mattered because the public often sees a serial offender as one enormous narrative, while Cortez must examine individual acts. A prosecutor cannot simply say, "This man committed many terrible crimes." The prosecution must establish specific offenses, specific victims, specific evidence, and the defendant's connection to each crime. The Golden State Killer case was especially challenging because the crimes had occurred over such a long period and in multiple jurisdictions. Yet the DNA evidence provided a powerful connecting thread. The same genetic profile appeared in multiple cases. That profile had been created from biological evidence associated with the attacks. The DNA established that one unknown offender was responsible for crimes separated by geography and time. Then genetic genealogy helped identify the man. The direct DNA comparison confirmed him. It was an investigative chain unlike anything available to the original detectives. The case also raised a new legal and ethical issue because genetic genealogy had been used to identify a suspect through relative. The technique was rapidly gaining attention, but its use in criminal investigations was still relatively new. The Golden State Killer investigation became a landmark demonstration of its power. Investigators had not found D'Angelo in a conventional criminal database. They had found a genetic path leading toward his family. That path became the bridge between anonymous DNA and a real person. The method would later be used in other cold cases, but in 2018, its implications were still being understood. Privacy advocates questioned how genetic databases should be used and what consent meant when one person's DNA could reveal information about relatives. Law enforcement officials emphasized the potential to identify violent offenders who had escaped justice for decades. The debate was complicated because both sides were responding to a genuinely powerful technology. DNA could solve murder, but genetic information could also reveal intimate biological relationships. The Golden State Killer case therefore became a turning point not only in criminal investigation, but in the broader discussion about genetic privacy. Yet, while society debated the implications, the victims had a much more immediate concern. They wanted accountability. They wanted the man accused of destroying their lives to acknowledge what he had done. And they wanted the justice system to recognize that the passage of 46 years did not erase the crime. For many survivors, the case was not ancient history. It was personal history. Every anniversary could carry memory. Every headline could reopen wounds. Every news report about another unidentified suspect could remind them that their attacker was still free. The arrest changed that. The fear of an unknown predator became the knowledge of a specific defendant. That knowledge could be painful, but it was also powerful. The mystery had been replaced by certainty. As the case moved toward resolution, prosecutors and defense attorneys began discussing the possibility of a plea agreement. A trial involving every available charge would be extraordinarily long and complex. It would require presenting decades of evidence and could force many victims to testify or endure repeated courtroom proceedings. A plea could provide certainty. It could secure convictions for a substantial number of crimes. It could establish the defendant's responsibility in a public courtroom, and it could spare victims from the uncertainty of a trial. The agreement that eventually emerged was extraordinary in scale. D'Angelo agreed to plead guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 kidnapping-related charges. He also admitted to numerous other sexual assaults that could not be separately prosecuted. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. The plea would mean that D'Angelo would spend the rest of his life in prison. But before that resolution could occur, the victims and their families had to face him. The courtroom would become the place where decades of silence finally broke. For the first time, many survivors would have the opportunity to speak directly to the man responsible for the terror that had followed them for most of their lives. Their statements would not change the facts. They would not restore lost years. But they could make one thing unmistakable. The crimes had consequences that continued long after the offender disappeared. The Golden State Killer had once controlled the narrative through fear. He chose when to enter. He chose when to leave. He threatened victims into silence. He disappeared before investigators could identify him. For decades, that silence remained. But now the victims were taking the narrative back. The defendant, who had once been able to vanish into the darkness, would have to sit and listen. The man who had spent 46 years without publicly acknowledging his crimes would hear the people he had harmed describe what his actions had done. And in that courtroom, the case would become something larger than forensic science. DNA had found him. Genealogy had led investigators to him. Police had arrested him, but the victims would define what his crimes meant. The final chapter would not belong to the killer. It would belong to the people who survived him, to the families who had lost loved ones, and to the investigators who refused to let the evidence disappear. After 46 years, the Golden State Killer was no longer a mystery, but justice still had one more stage to complete. When Joseph James DeAngelo finally entered the courtroom to face the consequences of crimes that had begun more than 4 decades earlier, the atmosphere was unlike anything surrounding an ordinary criminal proceeding, because this was not simply a defendant appearing before a judge. This was the man accused of being the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer, names that had haunted California for generations, and now the victims who had survived him, along with relatives of those who had not, were finally being given the opportunity to confront him in a courtroom. The man who had once controlled his victims through terror was no longer moving through darkness. He was seated in public. He could not hide behind a mask. He could not choose when the encounter ended. He could not disappear into another neighborhood. The years had stripped away the anonymity that had protected him for so long. DeAngelo had been arrested in April 2018 after investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to identify him, and his DNA was then compared with biological evidence from the crimes, confirming the connection. But the arrest had only opened the door to the final and most human part of the case. The prosecution now had to decide how to bring decades of violence into court without turning the proceedings into an endless sequence of trial. The answer eventually came through a plea agreement. But before that agreement became final, the legal process had to confront the extraordinary scale of the crime. Authorities ultimately attributed 13 murders, 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries to DeAngelo. Yet the statute of limitations and other legal restrictions meant that not every crime could be prosecuted as a separate charge. The case therefore became a careful exercise in deciding which offenses could be formally charged and which could be acknowledged as part of the broader history. Prosecutors eventually negotiated a resolution under which DeAngelo would plead guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 kidnapping-related charges. He would also admit to numerous other sexual assaults for which he could not be separately prosecuted. In exchange, prosecutors would not seek the death penalty. The agreement meant that the legal system could obtain convictions without forcing every survivor through a massive, prolonged trial. But a plea agreement did not mean the victims would remain silent. Quite the opposite. The sentencing proceedings became an extraordinary public reckoning. Survivors and relatives were given the opportunity to speak about what the crimes had done to them, and the courtroom became a place where the victims could finally confront the man who had once made them feel powerless. For decades, many had carried memories that could not be explained to people who had never experienced that kind of terror. The offender had attacked them in their homes, in places where they should have been safest. He had used threats, restraints, and psychological manipulation. He had invaded not only their physical space, but their sense of security. Some victims had been very young when the attacks occurred. Others had been attacked alongside partners. The psychological consequences could last for decades. When DeAngelo appeared in court as an elderly man, the contrast between his appearance and the image of the younger predator remembered by survivors was profound. Time had changed his body. It had changed his face. But it had not erased the memories of the people who had survived him. The courtroom therefore became a strange meeting between past and present. Survivors were looking at a 74-year-old man while remembering the offender who had entered their homes decades earlier. D'Angelo himself remained largely silent during the proceedings, but the victims spoke. Their statements became one of the most powerful elements of the case because they shifted attention away from the mythology surrounding the Golden State Killer and toward the actual human beings whose lives had been altered. For years, the offender had dominated headlines. His aliases became famous. His methods were studied. His ability to evade police became part of true crime history. But in the courtroom, the focus changed. The victims were no longer merely numbers in an investigative timeline. They were individuals explaining what had happened to them and what it had meant to live with it for 40 years. Their words also demonstrated why solving a cold case is not simply about identifying a suspect. A DNA match can establish a connection, but justice has another dimension. It requires acknowledging harm. It requires giving victims and families a place in the process. It requires recognizing that the effects of a crime do not end when the offender leaves the scene. The Golden State Killer had disappeared after his known series of crimes ended, but the consequences remained. Victims continued living with fear, anger, anxiety, memories, and unanswered questions. Families continued wondering whether their murdered relatives would ever receive justice. The arrest did not erase those consequences, but it changed the direction of the story. For the first time, the victims knew the man responsible was no longer free. He was in custody. He would not return to the streets, and he would not die without facing a legal judgment. The plea agreement also represented an unusual acknowledgement of the enormous scope of the case. D'Angelo admitted responsibility for crimes beyond the formal murder and kidnapping charges. Those admissions mattered because many of the sexual assaults had occurred so long ago that they could not be prosecuted individually. Without the admissions, some victims might never have heard the offender acknowledge what he had done. The legal system therefore used the plea proceeding to create a broader record of his responsibility. The defendant admitted to a pattern of violence that had terrified California for more than a decade. The man who had once been known only through descriptions and sketches was finally acknowledging the crimes in his own legal proceeding. Yet the most important fact remained unchanged. Nothing could restore the lives taken. 13 murder convictions represented 13 people whose futures had been destroyed. Among the victims were Lyman and Charlene Smith, Keith and Patrice Harrington, Manuela Withen, and Janelle Cruz, along with others whose deaths had remained unresolved for decades. Their families had lived with the absence created by murder while the investigation continued without an answer. In some cases, relatives died before seeing the killer identified. That is one of the cruelest realities of a cold case. Justice delayed does not only affect the people who are alive when the arrest finally occurs, it can arrive after generations have already passed away. Parents may die without knowing who killed their child. Siblings may grow old without answers. Children may become grandparents before learning what happened to their family member. In the Golden State Killer case, the passage of time created that exact kind of generational loss. The arrest in 2018 was extraordinary, but it could not give back the years that had disappeared. That was why the sentencing proceedings mattered so much. They created a public record in which the victims, rather than the offender, occupied the center of the story. D'Angelo could no longer define the narrative through fear. The survivors could speak without wondering whether the man who attacked them was still somewhere outside their homes. The uncertainty that had defined their lives was finally replaced by a conclusion. On August 21st, SIL 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The sentence brought the legal case to its final stage. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. There would be no possibility of release. The man who had evaded identification for 46 years would never again live as a free person. But the sentence also carried a painful irony. The legal punishment arrived when D'Angelo was already an elderly man. His freedom had lasted through most of his adult life. He had lived through decades that his victims had been forced to live with the consequences of his crimes. He had seen children grow into adults. He had experienced ordinary years that his victims never received in the same way. Justice had arrived, but it had arrived late. That lateness is central to understanding the Golden State Killer story. The case is often remembered as a spectacular forensic breakthrough, and it was investigative genetic genealogy demonstrated that a killer could potentially be identified through relatives whose DNA appeared in a genealogy database. But beneath the scientific achievement was a more painful truth. The breakthrough came because evidence had survived long enough to be useful. Investigators had preserved biological material. The forensic profile had remained available. When new technology emerged, the old evidence could be re-examined. The lesson was profound. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is a case waiting for the technology of the future. The Golden State Killer had benefited from the limitations of the 1970s. There was no modern DNA profiling. There were no genealogy databases capable of connecting distant relatives. There was no way for investigators to search millions of genetic profiles. The offender had operated in a technological blind spot, but the blind spot did not last forever. Science advanced. DNA became more powerful. Genealogy became digital. Investigators learned how to combine genetic relationships with traditional research. Eventually, a family tree became a roadmap to a Sacramento neighborhood. That neighborhood became the location of a surveillance operation. Surveillance produced biological evidence. The biological evidence produced a match. The match produced an arrest. The arrest produced a prosecution. And the prosecution ended with a life sentence. Each step depended on the previous one. Remove the preserved DNA, and the genealogy breakthrough disappears. Remove the genealogy research, and investigators may never have reached D'Angelo. Remove the surveillance and direct DNA comparison, and the genealogical lead might not have been enough. Remove the victim's willingness to cooperate, and the prosecution would have been incomplete. The case was solved not by one miracle, but by layers of evidence accumulating across decades. The final sentence, therefore, belonged to more than one generation of investigators. Detectives who worked the original crimes not have known that their evidence would someday identify the offender. Scientists who developed modern DNA profiling could not have known how their technology would transform cold case investigation. Genealogists who built family trees for ordinary people could not have known that the same relationships would help identify a serial killer. And the victims who waited decades could not have known whether they would ever see justice. Yet all of those threads eventually converge. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated the strange way time can behave in criminal investigations. 46 years can pass in the life of a person, but a piece of DNA can remain exactly where it was left. A detective can retire, but the evidence can remain. A suspect can grow old, but genetic markers do not age. A crime can disappear from the front pages, but the case file can remain open in the minds of the people who never stopped waiting. And when technology finally catches up with the evidence, the past can suddenly become present again. That was what happened to Joseph James D'Angelo. For decades, he appeared to have escaped the consequences of the crimes attributed to him. Then, in a matter of months, the investigation moved from anonymity to identification, from identification to arrest, and from arrest to conviction. The silence that had lasted since the 1970s was broken. But the final word did not belong to the killer. It belonged to the people who survived him and the families who had lost loved ones. Their stories transformed the case from a famous mystery into something much more painful and real. The Golden State Killer was never merely an unsolved name. He was a man who attacked people in their homes and killed others. The victims were not characters in a crime story. They were people whose lives continued after the crimes, marked by what had happened. And when the courtroom finally closed around D'Angelo, the most significant achievement was not that a famous mystery had been solved. It was that the victims no longer had to carry the question of whether the man responsible would ever be found. The question had an answer. The DNA had spoken. The genealogy had led investigators to the door. The courtroom had confirmed responsibility. And after nearly half a century, the Golden State Killer was finally no longer a ghost. The sentence imposed on Joseph James D'Angelo in August 2020 closed the courtroom chapter of one of the most notorious serial crime investigations in American history, but it did not close the story for the people who had lived through it, because a prison sentence could not return the years stolen by fear, could not restore the lives of those murdered, and could not erase memories that had survived for more than 40 years. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth revealed when the Golden State Killer was finally identified. Solving a cold case does not mean the past disappears. Sometimes it means the past becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, the victims had lived with uncertainty. They knew what had happened to them, but they did not know who had done it. They could describe the terror. They could remember the sounds, the threats, the movements inside their homes, the feeling of being watched, the fear that the attacker might return. But they had no name, no confirmed face, no knowledge of where the man had gone. That absence created its own kind of prison. The offender was somewhere in the world, and there was no guarantee he would never attack again. When the crimes eventually stopped, the silence was not reassuring. It was mysterious. Had he died? Had he been imprisoned for another offense? Had he moved away? Had he simply decided to stop? Investigators did not know. For years, the Golden State Killer existed in that space between memory and uncertainty. His crimes became part of California's criminal history, but the person responsible remained outside the reach of the law. Then genetic genealogy changed the direction of the investigation, and the arrest of D'Angelo transformed the meaning of all those unanswered questions. Investigators now knew where the killer had gone. He had not disappeared into some unreachable corner of the world. He had remained in California. He had lived an ordinary-looking life. He had grown old. He had raised a family. He had worked. He had retired. And according to the evidence presented by prosecutors, he had carried with him the secret of the crimes for decades. That revelation created a second shock after the arrest. The Golden State Killer had always seemed like an outsider, a shadow moving through neighborhoods at night. But the man investigators identified had lived within ordinary communities. He had neighbors. He had routines. He had a history. There was no visible sign that the person living behind an ordinary suburban door could be connected to one of California's most terrifying criminal series. That contrast became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It forced people to confront the difference between public identity and private behavior. But investigators did not need to speculate about D'Angelo's character. They had evidence. The DNA was the critical bridge between the anonymous offender and the retired police officer. The genetic genealogy investigation had produced a family connection, but investigators had followed that lead carefully. They had not simply accepted a genealogical possibility as proof. They conducted surveillance. They obtained a DNA sample. They compared that sample with the crime scene evidence. The match provided the confirmation necessary to move forward. That methodology became one of the most important lessons of the case. Genetic genealogy could identify a potential suspect, but the suspect still had to be independently confirmed through forensic evidence. The process combined old-fashioned police work with modern genetics. It was not a magical search engine that produced a name instantly. It was a long chain of reasoning. Investigators began with an unknown genetic profile. That profile was uploaded to a genealogy database that permitted law enforcement use. Genetic relatives were identified. Researchers constructed family trees. The number of possible suspects narrowed. Investigators considered age, geography, family relationships, and other known information about the offender. D'Angelo emerged as a person whose life appeared to fit the investigative picture. Then detectives watched him. Finally, they obtained his DNA and confirmed the connection. The simplicity of the final result concealed the complexity of the journey. For 46 years, investigators had been unable to answer a basic question: who was he? Within months, the answer became Jojo. The case also changed how law enforcement viewed old biological evidence. Before the Golden State Killer investigation, many cold cases appeared limited by the technology available when the crimes occurred. Evidence could be preserved, but there was no guarantee that future testing would provide more information. The Golden State Killer demonstrated the opposite possibility. Evidence could become more valuable as technology improved. A sample that could not identify anyone in 1978 could become the key to an arrest in 2018. The evidence itself had not changed. The technology had. That distinction was revolutionary. It suggested that thousands of unsolved cases might contain information that investigators had not yet learned how to extract. Across the United States, detectives began looking more closely at old sexual assault kits, homicide evidence, unidentified remains, and biological material preserved in evidence rooms. Cases that had been dormant for decades could potentially be reopened. The Golden State Killer had shown what could happen when a new investigative method met an old DNA profile, but the technique also raised questions that could not be answered by science alone. Genetic genealogy depended on information voluntarily submitted by people researching their ancestry or connecting with relatives. When investigators used such databases to identify suspects, they were sometimes relying on genetic relationships involving people who had never agreed to participate in a criminal investigation. One person's DNA could reveal information about another person. A distant cousin could unknowingly help investigators locate a suspect. That meant the technology was not simply a forensic tool. It was also a privacy issue. The debate intensified as other cases were solved through similar methods. Law enforcement agencies, genealogy companies, privacy advocates, and legal scholars began considering how these investigations should be regulated. What databases should permit law enforcement searches? Under what circumstances? What level of crime should justify the use of genetic genealogy? How should relatives be informed? Could innocent people become suspects simply because their DNA placed them somewhere inside a family tree? The Golden State Killer case had opened a door, but society now had to decide how wide that door should remain. For the victims, however, these larger debates were secondary to something more immediate. They had waited. They had survived. They had carried the memories. And now the man they believed responsible was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The legal outcome could not undo the crimes, but it provided something the cold case had denied them for decades: certainty. Certainty can be painful. Knowing who attacked you can force you to confront memories that anonymity once allowed you to keep at a distance, but uncertainty has its own cruelty. For decades, survivors could not know whether the person who had attacked them was still free. They could not know whether he had been watching the news. They could not know whether he had told anyone what he had done. They could not know whether justice would ever come. After D'Angelo's arrest, those questions changed. He was identified. He was prosecuted. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced. The case had reached a legal conclusion. Yet there was another question that remained emotionally powerful. How had he managed to lie for so long without being caught? The answer was not one thing. It was a combination of historical circumstances. The crimes occurred before modern DNA profiling. Law enforcement databases were limited. Agencies operated with less technological connectivity. The offender moved between jurisdictions. Different names were attached to different clusters of crimes. He concealed his identity and exploited the fear of his victim. He committed crimes at night and often selected targets where he believed he could control the environment. He benefited from the fact that forensic science had not yet reached the point where biological evidence could routinely identify unknown offenders. But he also left behind evidence. That is what makes the story so extraordinary. He was not caught because the evidence suddenly appeared. The evidence had been there all along. The biological material was already connected to the crimes. The genetic profile had already been developed. Investigators had already known that the same offender was responsible for multiple attacks. What they lacked was the bridge between the profile and a name. Genetic genealogy provided that bridge. In that sense, the Golden State Killer was not defeated by a single new piece of evidence. He was defeated by the reinterpretation of evidence that had existed for decades. The investigation became a lesson in patience. The detectives who worked the original cases could not know whether their efforts would succeed. They collected samples because that was what responsible investigators did. They documented crime scenes. They interviewed victims. They preserved records. They followed leads. Many of those detectives retired without seeing the answer. Some died without knowing who the killer was. Yet their work remained part of the eventual solution. Their evidence became the foundation upon which later investigators built. The same can be said of the victims. By surviving and reporting the attacks, by providing descriptions, by preserving memories, and by cooperating with investigators, they created the original record of the offender. Their experiences became evidence. Their stories helped establish behavioral patterns that later investigators could compare with the known history of D'Angelo. Their willingness to speak mattered even when no arrest seemed possible. That is another defining characteristic of cold cases. A witness may believe that a statement has failed because it does not immediately produce an arrest, but information can remain useful for decades. A description recorded in the 1970s can become significant when investigators identify a suspect in the 2010 S. A location can matter again. A vehicle description can be reconsidered. A biological sample can suddenly become decisive. The value of evidence does not always arrive at the moment it is collected. Sometimes it waits. The Golden State Killer case is perhaps one of the clearest examples of that principle. The killer believed, according to the prosecution's account, that he had escaped. He had survived decades without being publicly identified. He had watched the world change while his crimes gradually moved from active investigations to cold cases. But the evidence was still there, and eventually technology found a way to connect it to him. The final irony was that the killer's greatest protection had been time, but time also created the conditions for his capture. 46 years gave science enormous room to advance. DNA profiling became more sophisticated. Genealogy databases grew. Computerized records expanded. Investigators learned to combine disciplines that had once been separate. A case that seemed frozen became active again. The passage of time had not erased the evidence. It had allowed the tools for understanding that evidence to mature, and that is why the Golden State Killer case remains so important to modern criminal investigation. It is a warning to offenders who believe that decades can erase their crimes. It is a message to investigators who preserve evidence from cases that appear impossible, and it is a reminder to victims and families that an unanswered case is not necessarily a forgotten case. The laboratory can change. The databases can change. The detectives can change. The technology can change. But evidence can wait. In the end, the Golden State Killer did not disappear. He simply remained unidentified until investigators learned how to find him. The mask came off. The aliases collapsed. The anonymous DNA profile became a name. The name became an arrest. The arrest became a guilty plea. And the guilty plea became a life sentence. Yet for the people whose lives were permanently altered, the most important moment was not the headline announcing a spectacular forensic breakthrough. It was the realization that the man they had feared for decades could no longer hurt them. The door had finally closed. The silence had finally been broken, and somewhere inside the enormous archive of American cold cases, the Golden State Killer investigation left behind a message that would echo far beyond California. Time does not guarantee escape, because sometimes the smallest trace left behind at a crime scene can survive longer than the person who left it. The Golden State Killer case had reached a legal conclusion, but the scientific breakthrough that brought Joseph James D'Angelo to justice was already changing the future of cold case investigations, because investigators around the world had watched what happened when an unidentified DNA profile, preserved for decades, was combined with a technology that did not exist when the original crimes occurred. And suddenly, the idea of an unsolvable case began to look different. For decades, detectives had been taught that DNA could be useful only if the offender's profile was already known or eventually entered a criminal database. But investigative genetic genealogy challenged that assumption by turning family relationships into investigative leads. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that police did not necessarily need the killer's own DNA in a database. They might be able to find his relatives first, construct a family tree, and work backward toward the unknown offender. That possibility was extraordinary, but it also demanded discipline. A genetic relationship did not mean a person was guilty. A family connection was not a conviction. Genealogy could point investigators toward a suspect, but traditional forensic evidence still had to establish the connection. In D'Angelo's case, that distinction was critical. Investigators used genealogy to narrow the field, then obtained a direct DNA sample and confirmed that it matched the genetic evidence associated with the crimes. The technology had not replaced police work. It had expanded the path police could follow. That distinction became one of the most important lessons from the investigation. The public often imagined the breakthrough as a simple moment when a computer produced the killer arrest name. But the reality was far more complicated. Behind the arrest was a chain of decisions made by investigators, forensic specialists, genealogists, and prosecutors. The original evidence had to be preserved. A usable DNA profile had to be developed. The profile had to be entered into an appropriate genealogy database. Genetic relatives had to be identified. Family relationships had to be researched. Historical records had to be examined. Potential suspects had to be evaluated against the known facts. Surveillance had to be conducted carefully. Finally, investigators had to obtain independent biological evidence from the suspect. Only then could the case move from possibility to proof. That process mattered because the Golden State Killer case was destined to become a model for future investigation. Other detectives began asking whether their own cold cases contained biological evidence that might still be tested. Cases that had remained dormant for 20, 30, or 40 years were suddenly viewed through a different lens. The question changed from why has this case never been solved to what evidence from this case can be analyzed with today's technology. That was a profound change in investigative thinking, but the scientific excitement could never erase the human cost behind the evidence. Every DNA profile in a cold case came from somewhere. It came from a victim. It came from a crime scene. It represented a moment when someone's life had been violently interrupted. In the Golden State Killer investigation, the biological evidence was connected to victims who had endured sexual assaults and to crime scenes associated with murder. The laboratory could reduce the evidence to genetic markers, but those markers had a human story behind them. That was why the eventual identification mattered so deeply to survivors. They were not celebrating a technological achievement in isolation. They were seeing the person they believed responsible finally identified. For some, the news could bring relief. For others, it could trigger memories they had tried to suppress. The arrest reopened the past, but it also changed the future. The fear of an unidentified offender became the certainty of a man in custody. One of the most disturbing elements of the case was how long D'Angelo had apparently remained outside the reach of investigators. He had lived through decades in which the investigation repeatedly failed to identify him. The original crimes had eventually stopped, and without a known suspect, the case entered a different phase. Detectives continued working leads, but active investigative pressure inevitably changed. Cases can become quieter as years pass. Files are transferred. Officers retire. New personnel inherit old investigations. Technology changes. Priorities change. Sometimes the evidence remains in storage while the people who collected it move on. That is why cold case investigations often require